Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to talk a little bit about how async works in the latest version of Flask because it is now supported, and I'm also going to show you an example. So what I've done already is I've built an app that is synchronous, and it's synchronous but it uses 3 API calls. And the reason why I want to use this as an example is because I can use an async version that calls all 3 APIs at the same time. Whereas in the synchronous version, I have to call one at a time. So the first one gets called, it waits, the second one gets called, and then the third one gets called. So in this video, I'll show you how to convert this over once I show you the code, and I'll talk a little bit about how Async and Flask works. But first, I just want to say I do have Flask courses available. I have my Flask for Beginners course, which basically covers everything you need to know to get up and running with Flask. So if you're not familiar with all the basics of Flask, I think this course would be good for you. I cover both Flask and Flask SQL Alchemy and then build some example apps. And then I have the Flask extensions course, which covers some of the most popular extensions for Flask. It's more like a reference. So if you are worrying about how to use a particular extension, for example, Flask WTF, I have videos on that. So let's take a look at the code. Here I'm importing the things that I need. So I'm using the library HTTPX so I can perform the request. I'm using it because I can use it both with async and without async. So I'll show you that in a moment. I'm importing time so I can just show you how long it takes for the entire process to happen. And then I'm importing some authentication for the APIs that I'm using from this auth file. And then I have my standard Flask imports. I have the Flask class, render template, and requests, which I'll be using down here. And then in states.py, I just have a list of tuples with the state code and the actual state name, so it appears in my dropdown. So I instantiate the Flask app, and then here I have a route called sync, and it's for get and post requests. So what I'm basically doing is I'm creating this errors dictionary that will hold any errors that occur in the validation. So for example, if the first name is missing, like here, then I'll display first name as required. And I'll do the same thing for last name. Those are pretty simple validation. But for the other fields, I'm using the API to validate. So for example, with the email, I have errors email here. And what I'm doing is I'm just calling the API, so this EVA ping util here that I'm using, and I'm just checking to see if it has the data and if the data is available. If it's not deliverable in this particular case, I'll just say invalid email address. So the API returns other information, but that's not really too important for the purposes of this video. I don't want to focus too much on the validation part. It's more about the async part with multiple API requests. So I'm doing something similar for the address. The address is a little more complicated because it has more fields. But if any part of the address validation fails, then all the fields for the address will return as invalid. And then finally, I have one for the phone number, and it does the same thing. So if the phone number is valid, it returns nothing here in the errors for the phone number. If it is invalid, then it adds this message. And then I'm timing it to show you how long it takes so I can compare the before and after. And then I'm just printing it, and then I'm rendering the template. So this is the same render statement for both the get and post case. This is because I'm going to be dealing with the error messages if they exist. And just to show you the form, here I have a macro for the form inputs. Basically, it will add a class depending on if it's valid or not. And then it will display the error message. And basically, the rest of the template is just using that macro with the different fields. For the drop down, I don't need a macro because it's different from the regular text inputs. And I believe that's about it. So let me get into using this. So first, let me show you a demo. So if I hit submit here, all this information here is fine when I hit submit. So it all returns as green. But for example, if I take out the first name, I create an invalid number by just adding on some random digits. For the email, let's say I use something simple like a@gmail.com, which should be invalid. And then for this address, which happens to be one of the addresses for one of the Google offices in the US, if I change this to be, let's say, Detroit instead of Ann Arbor, and then the zip code is 12345 instead of the real zip code, then when I submit this, I should get a bunch of red when it returns. So here I see I'm missing the first name, the phone number is invalid, the email address is invalid, and all of the address fields are invalid. And if I take a look here, it tells me how long it took. So this was actually pretty quick, 2.8 seconds. So remember, with the synchronous approach, I'm calling one API, waiting for the response, and then I can call the next request, waiting for the response, and then finally the third and final request, and then wait for the response. And all this code that takes place in between the requests, it's pretty fast. So the time spent with that code is negligible because I'm not really going anywhere. I'm not calling anything. It's just standard Python. So really the part that takes a long time are the API requests. So what I want to do is I want to speed this up by using Async and Flask. So here I have the beginning of basically the same code, but as you can see, I don't have the API request yet because I'll be adding that in a moment. But first I want to talk a little bit about Async and Flask. So Async and Flask does not mean that Flask is truly an async framework, meaning the application server calls everything inside of your framework asynchronously. That's not the case. If you want a true async framework in Python, you can use something like Fast API, for instance. But in Flask, it's not true async. Instead, what they give you the ability to do is to create async functions. So here, if I just add the async here, this now becomes an async function. And inside of the code here, I can await other async functions or coroutines as they're called. So what happens here when this runs is inside of this function, a little world is created for this function only. So it's completely independent of everything else in the framework, the rest of your app, the rest of the server. And inside of this little world, inside of your function here, you can run async code. But as soon as it returns here, that role goes away. So the async no longer applies. So you can use as much async as you want inside of this one function here, but it can't do anything outside of it. So for example, you can't start a task on a separate thread and have the ability to get the results of that thread somewhere else. It doesn't work like that. It only creates an event loop inside of this one particular function, runs all the async stuff in it, ends the event loop, and then returns the data to the user. So it's really important to keep in mind when you're doing this. So it's not a true async first framework, and you don't want to force Flask to be something like that because it's not designed to work that way. But you can use async things inside of one particular function, one particular route, which I'll show you how to do in this video. So before I get started, I just want to warn you that when it comes to doing something like this, you have to think about the purpose of using async when you're writing a web app. The idea is you want to prevent the user from waiting too long for anything to happen that they need to know about. So for example, with validation, presumably you want to tell them the things that are invalid if they happen to be invalid, which is why this is a good use case. So I'm checking 3 different services to tell me if the data that the user has inserted is valid or not. If it's invalid, I want to tell the user that it's invalid. So this works for async because the 3 requests that I need to perform can all be done using async methods instead of synchronous methods. But if you're doing something like sending an email, for example, you don't necessarily need to tell the user that you've sent an email to them, right? You just continue on with whatever you're doing in your app. And then the email part can kind of be a separate thing. So you don't need async for emails. Instead, what you want to do is you want to use something like a separate thread for sending the email, or a separate service like Celery to send the email, because the user doesn't need feedback on what's happening with the email itself. They're going to receive the email, of course, in their email account, but that's separate from your actual web app. So just keep that in mind. And if you have any questions about this difference, just feel free to ask me in the comments down below, because I do think it can be a little confusing. But the general idea is if the user needs to know something and that something can be determined with async code, then that's when you can use async. If they don't need to know, if it needs to be done, but they don't need to know, then you don't necessarily need async in this way. So now what I want to do is I want to convert the sync example to async. So the most important thing I need to do is I need to call all 3 of the services, the 3 APIs that I have. So what I want to do is I'm going to use, first let me import from async.io. So import async.io. And down here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call async.io.gather. So what async.io.gather does is it allows me to await multiple coroutines. And by using the HTTPX library, each request is going to be a coroutine. And it basically gathers the results of each individual coroutine in a list of results or a tuple. Just some kind of iterable of results, right? So it would allow me to do something like this. If I do them in the order that I did them above, the first response is going to be from the email service. So I'll say email response. And then the second will be the address response. And the third will be the phone number response. So phone response. And like I said, this is an iterable. It's a tuple really. And it's going to return three things when I put them in here. It's going to return the response for the email request, the address request, and the phone request. And of course, because this is an async coroutine, I have to await it, right? So now inside of here, I need to put the three calls to the APIs. But before I can do that, I need to use the with statement to get the client for performing async requests with HTTPX. So to do that, I use with. It's actually async with, and then httpx.async client, so capital A, capital C, and I can just say as client, and then I can indent this. So this client will allow me to perform async requests. This method here of httpx.post or .get, those are sync requests. So that's basically the difference when you're using httpx. So inside of here, I'm going to perform those three in the same order. So first I'll get the email one. So here I'll get the email one and I'll just copy and paste it in there. And it's going to be a list of three things, but this should be client instead of HTTPX. So I'll just change that to client and then it's going to perform the request for me. Then I'll do the same thing for the next one, the address. And I'll take that and I'll put it in here. So I'll just remove the variable and then I'll change this to clients and then put a comma at the end so I can support one more. And then the last one will be for the phone number. So I'll take the phone number one here, copy it, put it down here, and I'll change the HTTPX to client. So now I have those three. And what happens is when it gets to this line of code, it's going to initiate pretty much every single request at the same time. Technically not at the same time, but like one right after the other. It's not going to wait for the response of the first one before it calls the second one like it does in the sync example. So theoretically, when we do this, the speed of the three requests will just be the speed of the slowest one to return. So for example, if the first one takes 1 second, the second one takes 2 seconds, and the third one takes 3 seconds, then it will be a total of 6 seconds spent getting the data, which would be the case in the sync example because it has to wait until each one finishes. But in the async example, since it doesn't have to wait, it's just going to take as long as the slowest one, which would be 3 seconds. So it will end up being twice as fast as the original sync example. So let me just move the data over so it makes more sense because I didn't pass the data. And let me just copy this. And I'll put the data up here. So this is the data for the address request. And then also let me make sure that I have everything else. So for the email validation, I have request.form email, that's fine. For the address, I have the data now, and then I have the auth that I'm importing from this other file with my credentials. And then for the phone number, I have the API key, which I'm importing from the credentials as well. And then I have the phone number. And I just have this default country US just to keep it simple. You can use these APIs for other countries, but I'm using the US only to keep it simple. And because the address verification API that I'm using only supports US addresses for their free account. They allow you to use international addresses as well, but you have to pay for that. So just to keep it free so everybody can try this, I'm just using US addresses only. And if you don't live in the US and you don't have an address, you can just do what I'm doing and go to some site that has addresses like this one for Google, and you can try these out in the example. So I have those three things there. And like I said, it should take as long as the slowest one instead of the combined total of all three. Right? And here, these will be the actual responses. So this code will just wait until all of this is complete. So once the slowest one is done, then it will move on to the next line. So I can exit out of this block and I can start doing the checks that I did before. So for example, with the email one, I can just copy this and paste it after the block with the checks, right? So this email response is going to come from this block here of the 3 calls, and then it's going to insert the errors. And then if I look at the address one, here is the address one. So I'll just put that one under the email address. And then finally, I'll do the exact same thing for the phone number. So let me just copy the phone number one down, and I will put it underneath the address verification. And then the rest should be exactly the same because I'm just passing the errors dictionary to the form. I'm passing the form data to the form as well, just so I can leave it there. And then I'm passing the states there so I can run the dropdown. So let's take a look at how long this takes when I run it. So let me go back over, and here I'm sync, and I'm going to move over to async. What I'll do is I'll actually open up a new tab. And the first thing we see is I need to install Flask with the async extras. So if you just do pip install Flask, it's only going to install the sync stuff or the typical Flask stuff. If you want to use Async and Flask, you have to use the extras. So to do that, I'll just turn off my server and then do pip install Flask with the square brackets for async. I'll install that, so it should be okay now, and I'll do Flask run again. And then I'll go to my form, and now we see the form. So first, let me try putting in some valid information. So I'll just copy the Atlanta address. Actually, let's keep it exactly the same as the original, which is all red. So I guess I can pick any example. So let's choose Austin here. So the city is going to be Austin. And then here's the address. So 500 West 2nd Street, Suite 2900. And then the zip code is 78701. The state is Texas, and then the phone number is going to be this, and I'll just remove the extra characters just to keep it simple. For email, I'll use prettyprinted@gmail.com, which I don't actually use. And then for name, I'll just do John Doe again. So let's see if this works when I hit submit. So we see the address returns is invalid, which is kind of surprising, but everything else works. So let's take a look at how long this took first. This took 1.05 seconds, which is basically 3 times faster than the original. So if I go over to my sync example and I use the same information, right? So I have this address or that phone number. This email address will be the same. So prettyprinted@gmail.com. And then the address will be 500 West 2nd Street, Suite 2900, Austin, Texas. And then the zip code will be 78701. So I'll hit submit on this one. And we see it returns valid for the name, phone number, and email, just like the one before. But the address, for some reason, is invalid. But we see here, this one takes 3.09 seconds, right? So 3.09 versus 1.072. So I'm guessing in this case, each API request takes about 1 second. So in the sync example, 1 second has to pass, and then it moves on to the next one, and then another second passes, and then the final one, 1 second. So a total of 3 seconds. Whereas in this one, like I said, they can all get initiated at the same time, and then as the results come back, they will be processed. So it takes as long as the slowest one, which is just 1 second. So it's 3 times faster in this case with pretty much the same exact code. So let me use a different address. I don't want to investigate too much on why this particular address for the Google headquarters doesn't work. So I'll just try this one in Colorado instead. So 2600 Pearl Street. There's no address 2. The city is going to be Boulder. And let me remove that address 2. And then the state will be Colorado. So Colorado, I'll hit submit. And now we see it returns green. And if I go back, it's 1.2 seconds. So a little bit slower, but it's still pretty fast. And if I just put the same information in here, so Boulder, and then the address here is 80302. Hit submit. It's going to take a little bit longer. And we see it takes 3.1 seconds. So in this particular case, the async example is much faster. The user doesn't have to wait as long to get the same information. So that's basically the example that I want to show you. So like I said before, the reason why you want to use this async stuff is when you want to give the user some kind of information and it requires something that could be used with async. So you can have multiple things that could be gathered, for instance, and you can save time by doing them all at the same time instead of doing them one after the other. So I'll have the code to this example in the description below so you can play around with it if you want. You'll just have to sign up to the APIs. I'll put a link in the code to the APIs as well if you want to test them out. But if you have any questions about this example or anything I talked about in this video, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll try to answer it. So that's it for this video. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. Thank you for watching this video, and I will talk to you next time.